It's going to Okay, welcome everyone today to our webinar on 3 Roads to Rome, Approaches to Systemic xSEL. Everyone will remain muted throughout the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature, which you can get to if you hover over the bottom of your screen, to submit questions for our panelists. We will be sharing an archive of this webinar and a copy of the slides after the presentation. And I am going to turn it over to Dave Adams for some introductions.
Thank you, Nova. So welcome to our webinar, 3 Roads from Rome, Approaches to Systemic xSEL. I'm David Adams, your host, Director of Social and Emotional Learning at the Urban Assembly. The very best SEL initiatives transform systems in ways that measurably improve teaching, learning, and student outcomes. The concept of system transformation, though, can be daunting. How do we get from the system as they are to the systems as we want them to be? This webinar features 4 leaders in the field of SEL who will discuss complementary approaches to systems design in support of social and emotional learning. I'm David Adams, Director of Social and Emotional Learning at the Urban Assembly, and I'm going to frame and facilitate this conversation. First, let me introduce Dr. Mark Greenberg. Dr. Mark Greenberg is the founder of the Create Center, and he's going to discuss the impact of teacher wellness and instruction on student outcomes. Mark is the Emeritus Bennett Chair of Prevention Science at Penn State, and he's the board chair of Create and one of the founders of CASEL. Mark began his career in prevention research 40 years ago because he wanted to intervene with families and children in early development before they could form serious mental health or drug and alcohol problems. Currently, his areas of research include prevention of behavioral health problems and a promotion of well-being in youth and their caregivers. Mark is passionate about conceptual and statistical models for understanding the effects of universal intervention. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, David. Glad to be with you today.
Mark, I don't know that many people who are passionate about statistical models, so I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Well, I'll try not to be too nerdy today.
Outstanding. Next, we're going to introduce Bridget. Dr. Bridget Hamre, CEO of Teachstone, will describe teaching practices that are the key drivers of student academic, social, and emotional learning and interventions to support these practices. Bridget is the co-founder of Teachstone and Research Associate and Associate Director at the University of Virginia Center for Advanced Study at Teaching and Learning. When Bridget was a teenager, she told her mom, a former hippie and teacher, that there were 3 things that she'd never do. 1, wear bell bottoms. 2, buy a minivan. 3, teach. Well, she went on to do all 3, and we're all better for it. Throughout her career in education, Bridget has seen firsthand how powerful relationships between students and teachers can be help to set children on a positive trajectory, both in school and in life. With her expertise in student-teacher relationships and classroom processes, Bridget authored the My Teaching Partner Coaching and Coursework. Welcome, Bridget.
Thanks, David. Good to be here. And I blame my twin 6-year-olds for the minivan, and I also like statistical models. So thanks, Mark.
I think the question on all our minds is, do you still wear bell bottoms? Both in school and in life. With her expertise in student-teacher relationships. All right, now moving on to Dr. Clark Mccowan, president of xSEL Labs, who will discuss the role of SEL data in supporting consistent and high-quality SEL practices. Clark is an award-winning social scientist and a leading expert on social and emotional learning assessments. In his role as a university faculty member, Clark has been the lead scientist on several large grants supporting the development and validation of SEL Web, Networker, and other SEL assessment systems. Clark is passionate about creating usable, feasible, and scientifically sound tools that help educators and their students. xSEL Labs is the embodiment of that passion. Welcome, Clark.
Thanks, David. Great to be with you. And our passions don't actually sound that interesting, but you make them sound interesting, so thank you.
Well, it looks like if people care about statistics, assessment, and teacher and student relationships, this is the webinar for you guys to be on. Well, each of these approaches provides a point of entry into systems change work that can benefit teaching, learning, and student outcomes. Following brief presentations by the panels, I'll facilitate a panel discussion to further explore how each of these approaches can be enlisted to support teaching, learning, and student wellness. But first, let's take a look at what it means to support systemic xSEL. On your screen here are two representations of a school. This diagram from the Rutgers Center for Character Education and Social and Emotional Learning represent two approaches to how we organize our school systems. The first is a jumbled, fragmented schoolhouse with multiple programs and approaches all on top of each other without a cohesive approach to measuring their impact. The second is a school organized around the principles of social, emotional, and academic development. You'll notice how the parts fit into each other, and how the large framework of social, emotional, academic development, or in this case, social, emotional, character development, allow the schools to create a cohesive framework for the work that they're doing. Today, we're going to talk about, from each of our panelists, how we can make sure that our schools look a little bit more like the second, and use a comprehensive framework of social, emotional, academic development to get there. Our first panelist will be Dr. Mark Greenberg, and he's going to talk about the work he's doing in order to achieve those outcomes. Mark?
Thanks, David, and welcome everyone. I thought I'd start with a nice quiet photo. This is going to be a knowledge session rather than a practice session, but most of what I'm going to talk about today has to do with the effect of practices. And I know that teachers I hope a lot of teachers are listening today, and we honor everything you've been doing both in the classroom and now on the web at home. And we just thank you for the work you're doing on behalf of all of our children. Saying that, the current situation for teacher well-being is not good. And I'm not talking about the COVID crisis especially, although we know this is putting lots of pressure and stress on teachers and parents. But there's a serious crisis of teacher retention in both the US and other countries. This is not a US problem. It's so in Israel and Britain and many, many countries. In the US, teaching is now rated as a highly stressful profession. Actually, with nursing, it's reported as the most stressful profession with, as you see, 46% of teachers reporting excessive daily stress. So while social emotional learning has been a field that's developed slowly over the last 25 years, the focus on teachers and their own social emotional learning and their own professional growth is really quite new and really has just in the last 5 years finally received the beginning of attention. For well students, we need well teachers. This seems like just common sense. We know, all of us know that when we are on a good day, we're feeling well, we have lots of energy, we do our work much better. And we know that teachers, when they feel well and they have lots of energy, do their work much better. And we know across the year, studying both teachers' well-being and their cortisol from doing physiological measurements, that there's a lot of wear and tear during the school year. And by the end of the year, as many teachers know, they've just about had it. And it really takes, as we've studied in our own work with the physiology of teachers, it takes a whole summer for teachers to recoup back to the place they were before. Now, that's a problem because teachers should not be facing this kind of stress where they become completely worn down, both psychologically and physiologically across the year. And what's often happening is this we call the burnout cascade, where teachers feel emotionally exhausted, and when they do, they begin to feel that maybe students are out to get them, and they feel a lack of accomplishment. And as we know, too many teachers are leaving the profession in the first 5 years. Tish Jennings and I, about a decade ago, developed a model called the pro-social classroom. And if we want to look at the end, the green, we see the outcomes, of course, we're all interested in is healthy students with good social, emotional well-being and academic outcomes. And we know that requires healthy classrooms and school climates. And we know that's dependent on healthy teacher-student relationships, Students we know will work much better when they feel that they feel respected and seen by their teachers, when teachers have good, effective classroom management, and when they implement effective SEL programs. But what we've forgotten about is the teacher's own social emotional well-being, and that's really the focus I'll spend today. We know the SEL competencies from CASEL, you've seen those many times for kids, but we can apply that same model to adult competencies. And in the work we've been doing and the work that many people have been doing on teacher or adult SEL, we've been using a similar model. We can think about intervention. We can wait until teachers are already ill or ready to quit their jobs or taking lots of mental health days or mental health leaves, or we can think about prevention. We can think about giving them a life jacket that really supports them so we don't get to the point where they need to have to be saved. And today I'm going to talk about two programs. First is the CARE program, Cultivating Awareness and Resilience in Education, developed by three people you see, Tish Jennings, Krista Turksma, and Richard Brown, with cooperation with the support of the Garrison Institute. The CARE program can be delivered in a variety of models. It totals about 18 to 24 hours and usually has some full day experiences or retreats. And the elements of it are teaching teachers, facilitating teachers' emotional awareness, awareness of their own emotions, how they're triggered in the classroom, mindfulness practices. But this is not, don't get me wrong, it's not sitting on a pillow for long periods of time, because we want to have practices that are both interpersonal and are brief, that people can actually really use when they have very busy lives like teachers. And also some practices around empathy and compassion for both themselves and others. These CARE workshops are done in a very active way with lots of discussion and role play, practice in small groups. So the teachers really learn these skills, and the workshops are done over time, so teachers can take some of these ideas, try them out, and come back and discuss how well they're working. CARE has been studied in a variety of places, including in rural Pennsylvania, in urban Pennsylvania, a very large study in New York City schools in the Bronx, and in Croatia. So we've studied it in different places, and we find pretty much the same findings. When we randomize teachers who are interested in the CARE program, those that receive the program show less reports of stress. They feel less time urgency, less rushed during the school day, even though nothing changed about their schedules. They show reductions in depression, anxiety, and physical symptoms of stress. They enjoy their teaching more. In our Croatian study, for the first time, we measured compassion for self and showed that teachers show more compassion for themselves after this CARE experience. And in New York City, we observed 226 classrooms and observed the quality of the teaching used in the class, which Bridget will discuss next, and showed improvements in the emotional experience of the classroom and the productivity of teachers. In New York City, we followed teachers for another year and found that these effects last, that teachers show lower psychological distress, greater mindfulness, and better regulation of their emotions, more adaptive emotion regulation 1 year later. There's another program we work with also called CALM. CARE is more of a retreat program. CALM is a place-based program that happens every morning at the start of the school day before school begins, developed by Alexis Harris, who is now the director of the Compassion program at Louisville, Jefferson County Schools. It's place-based, it occurs in the building. It's a yoga-based program, 4 times a week in the morning for 20 minutes before the school opens. We did a randomized trial of middle school teachers in Pennsylvania, and we showed that their stress was lowered both by their self-report and by measuring their awakening morning cortisol response. That's the response in the first 30 minutes when we pep up for the day without coffee. They showed improvements in efficacy or enjoyment of teaching. They showed a lower rate of physical symptoms of stress, and actually affected their systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So we need to think about systems change and think about a holistic picture of supporting social and academic development and well-being. We know a lot about the effective conditions for learning and norms for caring in schools. We know a lot about social emotional skills and social emotional development. But what's been missing is the third and important component, which makes all this work, which is teachers and administrators who are well They have a strong awareness of themselves. They're able to be present in the classroom. They take an equity standpoint towards their students. And I just want to reinforce the idea that if we're going to do systems change, both working with administrators and teachers is critical for this process. Now, on the Create website, you can find lots more about care and calm. You can go and listen to audio mindfulness practices, go to our YouTube page and see videos of the effects of care and teacher reports of how they feel after care. But we only think about this as one part of a larger change process, of systems change. And now, David, I'll hand it back to you, and we can bring Bridget in to talk about the critical nature of teacher instruction.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that great presentation. I'm now going to introduce Bridget one more time back to our conversation. And Bridget, please give us a presentation around the interactions between students, teachers, and how that supports social and emotional development.
Great, thanks, David. So it's really amazing to have a handoff from somebody like Mark, who's been a colleague, a friend, and inspiration throughout this work. I also really appreciate centering the work around educators themselves. Although most of my work in my career has focused on interactions between teachers and children, ultimately the health and well-being of the educators comes first and foremost. So I just also extend my great appreciation to all of those of you doing this work now in this crazy time that we're living, but also in the everyday. Let's see. So I think it will come as a surprise to anyone who does this work that although there are many things that matter to our students, nothing matters more than the interactions that they have every day with their teachers, with their peers in the classroom. And that's really been the center of the work that I've done throughout my career, thinking about how can we understand what kinds of interactions matter the most to students, and then support educators across the country and across the world in making sure that more and more of our students have access to great teaching each and every day. We've done a lot of that work using an observational tool that Mark referred to called the CLASS, or the Classroom Assessment Scoring System. It's an observational tool and now a set of aligned professional development resources that helps schools really measure and improve the interactions that matter most. There's a long history of research using the CLASS. I won't talk about that a lot here. And I thought I'd actually leave it up to a colleague and friend of mine, Dominique McCain, who works at an organization called the Commit Partnership in Dallas, Texas, to explain in her own words a little bit about what CLASS actually is. It's a very short little video I'll show here.
I describe CLASS as the how of an educator's job. So often educators are told the what of their job through a variety of evaluations and a variety of observations, but very seldomly does anyone get granular enough to help them understand immediate action they can take to transform what's happening in their classroom. CLASS does that. From the domains down to the dimensions, down to the indicators, down to the behavioral markers. It teaches and gives a very clear path for educators of how to do their job. So to me, CLASS is the how of an educator's job.
So one of the things that I think we often talk about with CLASS is that although many of us sort of know and feel what good teaching is, we're often not able to describe it or have a vocabulary that we can carry forward. And that's really a part of what the CLASS has done, is provide a vocabulary for what good instruction looks like that can be shared across an organization in ways that lead to systemic improvement. So just as an example of how we've scaled the CLASS, the entire state of Louisiana's early childhood system is built around using CLASS as an observational tool. They do about 20,000 class observations every year across the state and have built local capacity. And research coming out of the University of Virginia by my colleague Daphne Basak shows systematic improvement year upon year in the ways in which children are exposed to effective interactions in birth to 5 programs across the country. It's really important to say that this work is happening across the country and not just sort of centered here in Charlottesville, Virginia. There are about 200 studies, more than 200 studies that have used the CLASS over time. It's above and beyond what I'll do today to talk very much about the class, but we measure sort of 3 broad domains of what makes great teaching: emotional support, classroom organization, and instructional support. And for the remainder of my conversation today, I'll really focus in on those elements of the classroom that we know are most supportive to social emotional learning outcomes. One thing to highlight is that there's great research showing, or sort of unfortunate research showing how few children actually have access to great teaching. So one recent study that was conducted in rural North Carolina and Pennsylvania followed a group of children from kindergarten through 3rd grade and did class observations every year. And what they found was only 4% of children in these rural areas actually had access to good teaching every year from kindergarten to 3rd grade. And it's important to say that this wasn't phenomenal, great teaching. It was really just at a threshold that we've shown is important for producing positive outcomes for children. In fact, fewer than half of the kids in the sample had what was classified as a good teacher in even a single year. And within the sort of poor rural sample, Black students and students who were even more poor were even less likely to have effective teachers. There are so many great examples of good teaching happening, but what we haven't figured out how to do is really to provide the consistent support and structures for educators across this country to enable them to actually do this work every day in their classrooms. And I think that the work Mark talked about around teachers' own emotional well-being is one important piece of that. But what are some things that you can actually do? So none of these will come as a surprise to educators across the country, but I'm going to highlight 3 sort of high leverage practices that we've shown in multiple studies are so critical to supporting social emotional skills in the classroom. And it's important to say that our approach is not a curricular approach. Curriculum is important, but our focus is really on how can educators build on those everyday moments that occur to support social emotional learning. We'll always start and center that work around relationships. Developing relationships between teachers and children and among students is the most important thing that can happen. And I'm feeling so inspired right now watching examples across the country of how educators are getting creative about supporting these relationships even in this challenging time. It's important, more important now than ever before. But talking about relationships can be kind of abstract. So what do we actually mean? Well, when we go in and observe classrooms, we're really looking for opportunities where teachers are engaging in social conversations. They're showing they care, they know something about their students above and beyond how they're performing on their academic assessments. And they just take every little small moment as children are walking in the classroom, as they're walking out to recess, to connect in very personal ways. They're also not sitting on the sidelines. They're joining in activities with students, and they're really thinking every day about how to model those pro-social behaviors. One of the things we know from research is that students are always watching. So if I'm a student in a classroom, my relationship with my teacher is influenced not only by how she interacts with me, but how she interacts with other students, because I'm a student, I'm paying attention. And if I see you being disrespectful to a friend of mine, I may be less willing to trust you in the end. So really being attentive of modeling that behavior, those pro-social moments each and every day is just critical. We also really want to see teachers giving students authentic and meaningful voice, looking for every opportunity to elicit their ideas, opinions, and making sure we're seeking diversity in those perspectives and paying attention to those students who are less likely to speak up and finding ways to support them to do that. When we see this happening, you really see transformation in the classroom. And it's important that this isn't just a sort of transactional thing, but that we as teachers need to demonstrate that we actually care. We're attentive, we're listening, we're asking follow-up questions. We really are interested in ideas, even if they're crazy and absurd and different from our own. In fact, maybe we're more interested when they say those things. We also need to be attentive to the ways in which students don't naturally know how to have these kinds of conversations with each other. So we're modeling these kinds of eliciting questions and demonstrating our care and our interest in our listening capacities and supporting students to do that in their small group work with one another. Lastly, I think we can really be paying attention to those moments that are those naturally occurring moments for social emotional learning every day in the classroom. It's great to have a curriculum that introduces young children, for example, to feelings and emotions like frustration and anger and happiness and sadness. but it's really, really powerful when we follow those curricular moments with the everyday moments when they come up. So when a student is feeling frustrated, that we're able to help them label that feeling, to acknowledge it, and to do the same for ourselves. So we see teachers who are centered and present and doing some of the work Mark talked about for their own well-being are able to just simply label their feelings and encourage children to do the same, and to be really explicit about opportunities for modeling social skills. So these are just a few of the many things that class observations help pick up on. And the advantage of using a tool like class or another observational tool is really just this idea that these are not abstract skills that teachers have. We can help teachers focus on, get meaningful feedback, and improve them in ways that demonstrate not only changes in teaching practice, but most importantly, support the skills of the students that they care about so much. So I'm going to end there, pass it back to Dave, and we'll get to hear Clark talk about a third sort of systems level change that is important in this work.
Thank you so much, Bridget. I think the quality of interactions is something that's really deeply on our minds right now. And I appreciate your insights into how we can improve that using the class tool. Mark, I think you have some opportunities here to talk about some other ways of improving around assessment. Your presentation is supporting high quality SEL practices using assessment. I'm going to turn it over to you to hear your thoughts on this matter.
Thanks so much, David. And I want to thank Bridget and Mark and you for agreeing to be part of this panel. It's so amazing to have a conversation with people whose work I admire so much and who've had such a great impact on the field of research and practice. I also want to thank everybody who's here today. We have about 1,000 people on Zoom and another close to 1,000 people streaming live on Facebook. And thank you for your patience with us as we figure out how to do simultaneous presentations of this kind of work. Now, it's really nice to go right after Bridget for all kinds of reasons, but one is that I think that when she was talking about the use of the class and to support high quality instruction, she really gives a wonderful example of the way that measurement using the classroom assessment scoring system can be used to support practices that in turn are good for children's academic, social, and emotional development. And I'd like to sort of pick up on that line of conversation by talking about the ways in which SEL assessment in general can, and I think should be used to support social and emotional learning practices. I'll say that one of the wonderful things about this conversation, I think, is that each of our presentations reflects one point of entry into systemic SEL, whether it's taking care of teachers, whether it's supporting high quality instructional practices, or whether it's using assessment to support instructional practice and SEL. It's not that any one of these solves the entirety of the problem, but each of them is one piece of the puzzle, and how we fit them all together per Dave's original slide, I think, is the real challenge for the field. Okay, let me give you a single slide that sort of summarizes the main point of my presentation, which is that I think that only if we are, or educators are routinely assessing practices and the outcomes that they're intended to produce, is it possible to sustain consistent and high quality social and emotional learning practices that have a maximum benefit on teaching, learning, and student outcomes. That's kind of the thesis of my presentation. But of course, we have to assess practices and outcomes to sustain high quality practice. Why should we assess? Well, the purpose of assessment, in my view, is to support consistent and high quality practices that we know lead to advances in students' academic, social, and emotional development. That's the why. What should we assess? Well, I think there are three important things to assess to support consistent high quality practices. I'm going to go in reverse order here. One is implementation. What are we doing? Two is student social and emotional competencies. What sorts of skills and dispositions are students developing as a result of our practices? And third is the climate, the overall conditions of learning that are supportive of students' feelings of safety, belonging, academic support, and important developmental outcomes. So this is the main set of points I want to make today. Well, let's talk for a second about social and emotional competencies, because my company, xSEL Labs, focuses on SEL assessment development with a specific focus on assessing social and emotional competencies from kindergarten through 6th grade. So the competencies that I always urge people to assess are those that matter, that are, for example, in the CASEL model, that are in your state standards. If you're in a state that has social and emotional learning standards, those standards say what competencies students should know and be able to demonstrate at different ages. These should be competencies that are important locally. What does your community care about? And that you plan to, and these should be competencies that you plan to intentionally teach. So in my view, the perfect decision about what to assess is the overlap among these 4 considerations. They should matter, they should be in the standards and expectations, they should be important locally, and they should be the targets of instruction. Okay, so that's kind of a whirlwind tour about what to assess. Well, how can you assess social and emotional competencies? There are 3 or 4 kind of main strategies that are usually taken to assess social and emotional competencies. One is self-report, where students rate statements that reflect their competency levels. For example, a self-report statement about emotion recognition might be, I know what other people are feeling. And then the student would rate how true that statement is of themselves. Okay to do this for older students, but younger students have a hard time with self-report. Second is teacher rating skills or teacher report. This is where teachers rate the frequency of behaviors reflecting social and emotional competence. An item that also reflects emotion recognition might be understands what others are feeling. Is that almost never true or almost always true? In this case, the teacher is the respondent rating the student's level of competency. And then a third strategy that's less used is direct assessment, where, for example, children look at pictures of faces and say what the person is feeling from their facial expression. This is direct in the sense that students have to demonstrate their competency by solving challenging problems in the social and emotional domain. They're not rating their own competencies. Someone else is making a judgment about their competencies. They're essentially showing what they know. And CELWeb, our assessment, uses predominantly a direct assessment approach to get at things like how well kids understand others' feelings, how well they can take others' perspectives, how well they can solve social problems, and how well they can self-regulate. Now, let's talk a little bit about other things besides competences that are important to assess. I mentioned not just student social and emotional competence, but implementation. And this really has to do with some questions about how often are SEL practices used and put into practice, and how well are they put into practice. In some ways, I know that the class that Bridget described isn't really an implementation measure, but in a sense, it's a measure of the implementation of high quality instructional practices. If you're using an SEL curriculum or program, the question is, how do you know how much teachers are actually using the program and how well they're using it? It's really important to try to get a handle on that, because it's hard to do new things, and some teachers are going to take the ball and run with it when a new SEL program is adopted, and others may have a harder time adopting that program. So knowing where teachers are taking the ball and running with it, where they're struggling, so you can support the implementation, is really key. And then a second piece that's important is student climate, which really has to do with students' perceptions of the conditions of learning. And there are several different pieces of that we know are predictive of student outcomes. One is how safe students feel, how much they feel that they belong, that they're connected to adults and peers, and how much they feel that they're supported as learners, that they're getting instructional support. All 3 of these then, competence, implementation, and climate, are important pieces of the picture that, if you have some way to systematically measure, can really support consistent high quality implementation. Let's talk a little bit about how that might look. How could a school or a school district, for example, use these kinds of assessment tools to support practice? Well, if this is a school year going from fall to spring, imagine assessing students' social emotional competence and climate early in the school year. Imagine then sitting down with your grade level team meetings and reviewing data about competence and climate, and using what you learn to make judgments about what you're going to do with the scope and sequence of your SEL program, what kinds of informal instructional practices you're going to use, what other resources you're going to bring to bear to improve the climate and support student competencies. And then imagine that you measured implementation along the way and provided support to teachers who were having difficulty implementing. And then you reassessed competence and climate later in the year to see how things progressed. Did students acquire greater levels of the competencies? Was the climate improved? And then you redo this process in the fall. This is really a kind of continuous improvement model of SEL assessment to support instruction. So I'm just going to take a minute to describe a kind of case study of how this might look. How do you put your data to work using that kind of practice model? Well, imagine you did this. You assessed student social and emotional competence in the fall. And imagine that you learned this. This is I'll explain this chart in a second. So this chart shows student performance in a classroom across a number of different social and emotional domains. Each bar is a social emotional competence, and it shows the percentage of students scoring well above average, in the average range, a little below average, and well below average. Now, what you can see from this, is that, that this bar has the most light green or medium green and dark green. So 50% of students are in the average range or above, 50% are below. This is an area of relative need. This is social problem solving. Whereas with emotion recognition, a lot of students are scoring in the average range or above. That's an area of relative strength. Okay, so you learn that about your students. Well, what do you do with that? Imagine that you're a second grade teacher, that was your classroom, and you're using this program, the Ruler program, which is an evidence-based SEL program. This shows the lessons in the Ruler scope and sequence and each of the competencies assessed by CEL-Web or measure. Wherever there's a check mark, it means that lesson was designed to teach that competence. 2 check marks means that lesson mainly focused on that competence. So remember, social problem solving was an area of challenge. That's this light blue set of cells. The social problem solving lessons don't come until the end of the scope and sequence. So one of the things you could do is think about how might you supplement the Ruler curriculum earlier in the school year to provide children an opportunity to practice those competencies so they can build them up even as they're learning other competencies. Okay? Imagine you did that, and then what you did was, and you have plenty of opportunities throughout the course of the day to reinforce these competencies on the playground, during group time, during directed instruction, during informal, unstructured study time. There are plenty of opportunities for social problems to arise, and plenty of opportunities, therefore, to coach students through resolving those problems, which is a way to reinforce this very competence. So you use your curriculum, you use informal strategies, and then you monitor the implementation of those strategies and reassess. And then when you reassess, this is what things look like, for example. Or social problem solving, remember 50% of students were doing okay, 50% were struggling. In the spring, it's moved up to 70%. So this is a kind of a whirlwind tour through this, but this is one model for using assessment data to support consistent and high quality and high impact social and emotional learning practices. I really think that there's a key and under-acknowledged role of just good data to help support practice. And I hope this has been helpful to you as you think about how that might apply in your settings. I have a book available about using social and emotional competence assessment data to support practice. I don't get much of a royalty, so I'm not going to get rich off this, but I hope that it's useful to you if you want to do a deeper dive into this. Okay, thank you for your time, and I'm going to hand it back to Dave.
Thank you so much, Clark. I really appreciate your overview on the importance of assessment and the types of assessment that we can be using to support systemic social emotional practice. So as a review, Mark, you talked about teacher development of social emotional skills. You talked a little bit about teacher retention and some of the challenges that we're seeing in teacher retention. Bridget, you talked about the quality of teacher and student interactions and some of the concerns that we're seeing based on the measurement of the class. And then Clark, you took this notion of measurement beyond just interactions and talked about measuring environment, measuring competence in terms of students, as well as measuring the quality of overall social emotional learning in terms of implementation. So the first question I have, and I'm gonna put this out to Bridget and Mark. So Bridget and Mark, specifically, you talked about some of the crises in teacher retention right now. The 40% over the turnover rate in terms of 5 years leaving the profession. And then Bridget, you talked about the quality of teaching being not as high as it could be. So how do we square these two things? The importance of improving the quality of teacher-student interactions with the idea that teachers are already leaving the profession because of the level of stress that we see.
Mark, I'm gonna let you take it
Richard,
first.
I'll kick it out off and let you add.
Yeah, perfect.
We tend to think that most of what teachers need to learn, somehow they're going to learn their pre-service before they actually take their first job. But we know from many, many teachers, the first couple of years are very difficult for many teachers. If you talk to teachers that are in their 15th or 20th or 25th year, they'll say things to you like, it wasn't until my 10th year that I really became a good teacher. And then between my 10th and 15th year, I became a great teacher. And that's often because they just have not gotten a lot of good quality in-service, the kind of work that Bridget's talking about, in order to really improve. And in every profession, just like in law or medicine, ongoing quality improvement is really critical. And we have not invested in spending the time that's necessary to really support teachers to really grow in their professional development.
I agree 100%, Mark. And I think we'd also be remiss in this moment not to call out the sort of core importance of compensation. So I do so much of my work in early childhood in the birth to 5 community. And the average early childhood teacher makes something like $30,000 a year. And it's lower than that in some sectors, slightly higher in others. They make less than kindergarten teachers, even if they're teaching in the same school. Compensation is not the only answer, but until we actually as a society recognize the work of teaching as instrumental and foundational to the success of our whole society, I think we're going to have real challenges here. But it's not just about compensation. And I think Mark's points about ongoing professional development or growth are really important. I think there's also really innovative things happening. So there are teacher education programs in schools across the country that are playing around with technology, using things like classroom simulators, where we can put our teacher education candidates or even teachers working in the field in a setting that feels very real, but without the same stress of sort of hurting real children. And I think there's some great evidence that through systematic coaching in some of those virtual worlds, we can see improvements in practices that people can then take into the classroom. So lots of sort of structured, regular PD work to happen, but also some key innovations.
Can I add one more thing, Dave?
Please, Mark.
There's a danger here of blaming the victim. Teachers leave because they're not good enough for their job, or teachers need more social emotional competence, like the kind of work I've talked about with CARE, because they're deficient. That's not the case. It's that they work in a very difficult profession in which improvement is really important. But the bigger issue is the systemic organizational changes needed in schools, because this is not just at the level of teachers and paraprofessionals, it's at the level of principals. Principals are the most stressed of all. They leave their jobs very quickly. And if principals aren't stable in their schools, then we don't create the kind of community we need. And especially in high-risk neighborhoods, teachers and principals are turning over so quickly that there's no stability in these neighborhoods for the children who need the most stability. And so really have to think about this as a systemic problem. And I would encourage everyone to look at CASEL's 10 indicators of change, of systemic school-wide SEL, and think about checking out the CASEL School Guide, which provides a really broad model for how to make these kinds of improvements.
Thank you, Mark. So Clark, the next question is to you. Sticking on this notion of stressors to the system, I know a lot of teachers have been excited because we've been alleviated of the pressure of standardized tests at the end of this year. How does SEL assessment play in this role of over-testing students and the critique around how we understand what matters in education?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and we sort of are up against this kind of tension in our work every day because nobody wants to spend time testing kids, and I completely understand that. I love assessment and data, and I don't want to test kids unless it does more. Well, yeah, I am, but I'm also passionate about only doing it if the benefit is going to be greater than the cost. And I'm talking about not just the financial costs, but the 25 to 30 minutes it takes to assess the children, and then the time it takes to have a conversation about the data. So, my view is that there has to be a benefit that's greater than the cost of assessment for it to be worthwhile for anybody to take on. That's academic and SEL assessment. We know that it's really, really hard to sustain evidence-based practices in a way that maintains the parts about them that produce good outcomes. And we also know that, and this is in mental health systems, it's in education, it's in public health, it's across all kinds of different systems. We can prove that something works in a really nice field trial, but then you put it into the complex systems we're talking about, and quickly these things can lose their effectiveness. So my view is that if assessment can truly help increase the likelihood that we'll be doing sustained high quality work, then I would bet you anything the cost in terms of time and money of doing the assessment is going to pay for itself many times over in terms of the practices that are unfolding in classrooms and the outcomes that they're producing in terms of children's academic, social, and emotional development.
Thank you, Clark. And the notion of prevention, and Mark has done his whole career, this notion of prevention, leads us to kind of a weird situation where the better you do, the less you see the thing that you're trying to reduce, right? So can you tell me a little bit more about how assessments can be used as a function of communication in terms of supporting the sustainability of these kinds of approaches in the context of prevention and promotion science?
Is that directed to me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that I've learned in my assessment journey is really about the complexity of systems. And just to be very simple-minded, when I first started on this, I thought a really well-validated assessment that produces really meaningful scores was enough to have good things happen. I've learned that that's not at all enough. And to me, the question of data use, the kinds of conversations people have about assessment data, who's at the table, what decisions are being made based on interpretations of the data, are absolutely critical to whether the way the data are being used are going to lead to improvements in practice and improvements in student outcomes. So I'm not sure that this is directly answering your question, Dave, but I really feel as though if we're going to have fewer problems down the road and increases in wellness, it's not just about collecting the data. It's about using it, and that's not a foregone conclusion. Many schools, schools vary tremendously in terms of how much they systematically use their assessment data to make decisions, whether it's reading data or SEL data. I find that when there's already sort of a culture of data use, it's easier to take SEL data and integrate that into the conversations that are already ongoing. When that hasn't been established, then the systemic work that needs to happen is a little bit more fundamental, which is how do we establish the kinds of conversations we need to have so that not only are we collecting the assessment data, whether it's about reading or SEL, but we're also talking about it, we're making good use of it, we're making sound decisions based on what we're learning.
One of the things that I would add to what Clark said is I hear us all often using the word complexity. So it is complex systems. However, I love this quote I read recently from Oliver Wendell Holmes, which is something like, I wouldn't give a fig for simplicity on this side of complexity, but I give my life for simplicity on the other side of complexity. And the idea there is like, this is not a simple system. We don't expect simple solutions, but if we don't push hard to make things simpler for people to do in practice, then we're just going to get mired in the complexity. So I worry a little bit about us getting mired and stuck about the system. So I really appreciate Mark sort of highlighting 10 practices. And I think that's a part of what we try to do with the class, is take something incredibly complex and put it into some building blocks and sort of simple things that aren't ultimately simple, but that make them approachable. And I think that's something we really need to do in this SEL work right now, because as your great picture at the beginning pointed out, it still too often feels like we're asking the practitioners to put together all of those pieces in ways that ultimately do a disservice to our teachers and ultimately to our students as well.
And speaking of the class, Bridget, I mean, the class is one of the few instruments out there that really does a good job of integrating the social and emotional and academic dimensions of student learning. Can you tell me your sense of the role that social and emotional development plays in students' academic access?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of the things that I think has been useful about the class is that we don't categorize things separately as social, emotional, and instructional entirely. In fact, sometimes people ask us, can I just do the emotional support element of the class? And I always say, well, it's actually kind of free. If you're going to learn it, you just learn the whole system. And I think that's because it's actually ultimately integrated. So one of my favorite findings is from Anne Gregory, who was doing work on our coaching program. And they actually found that our coaching around the class improved academic outcomes, but it also decreased disciplinary infractions, especially among African American high school students. And what was compelling about that research is when they dug into it, it wasn't the sort of emotional elements of the class that really explained that impact on discipline practices. It was the instructional. And it was those students who were most likely to get kicked out of the classroom feeling engaged and inspired and supported in their cognitive development that ultimately led them to feel more connected. So I think a part of it is a recognition that we don't want to sideline SEL to be just about the sort of emotional parts. And the more we can get to instruction itself, sort of building on social emotional competencies, is where I think we'll really start to see transformation.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. We've been using the class at the Urban Assembly for a while to think about the intersection between academics and social emotional development. And one of the points that I've always appreciated was this simple indicator that teachers recognize the emotional inputs of academic lessons. So they just name this is going to be a frustrating problem, right? And just that naming helps students recognize that, and teachers really recognize that academic development is both cognitive and social emotional as students overcome problems. And so thinking about overcoming problems, Mark, before we go to the questions in the audience, what is the work that we need to be doing for our teachers in terms of having them think about the emotional components of learning in our pre-service to better prepare our teachers for success in the real world?
Well, if there's ever a time when social emotional learning for children and adults should be highlighted, it's now. Because what's social emotional learning for both children and adults? I mean, we're all struggling as adults, of course, also, is it builds our resilience, our ability to cope. And if there's anything we need now, and we know for the future, is to help teachers and students really learn to cope and be resilient. And so the opening of schools, the welcoming back, not just of students, but of teachers, is a very delicate time. And it's a time for us to really think about how to reshape our schools. A lot of money has been allocated now for online learning.
Yes.
We need to allocate money for creating the kind of schools we really care about, which are schools in which everyone is seen and respected, really loved. The children really need to be loved as they come back to school this year.
Well, I appreciate that. And we have some questions here in the question and answer box, and I'm just going to go through some which I think have been popped up to my screen. From Darla Williams, she's interested in implementing social and emotional development at home. What can parents do to support social and emotional development in the home? And I'll turn this over to whoever wants to speak to it.
Well,
Go ahead, Mark. First of all, the Castle has an enormous number of resources on their website. And if you also go to YouTube to Castle Cares, you'll find a number of recent presentations on both parenting and well-being, both for teachers and parents, building resilience, that I think would be very helpful to people.
Thank you.
My add-on is just, if I had to ask one single thing, and I try to remind myself of this with my 13-year-old and my 6-year-old twins, which is this idea of banking time with our kids. Right now, the relationships are the most important thing, and spending 10 minutes a day of non-structured time when you're not expecting anything of those kids, but you're really just being with them, banks time in ways that will return to you in the long run. So it's hard in these crazy times to make time for that, but it's so essential.
Yeah, I mean, I think also when I think about parenting, I think about your point, Bridget, in terms of modeling, and what does it mean to model things that get kids, they pay attention to what we do more than what we say. So those are really great suggestions. We have another question up here talking about e-learning. It says, nowadays, many teachers are facing distance learning with young children. How can we implement SEL in our curriculum through e-learning? And Clark, I want to raise this in your context in terms of this notion of implementation and measuring implementation. And what does this translation to e-learning look like in terms of how we understand the implementation of social emotional learning?
I think we're making it up as we go along, is the honest to God answer. Yeah, right. And so I always, both in terms of the last question and this one, I sort of feel like trying to keep it as simple as possible seems like it's really, really key in this period of time. And, one of the things I keep thinking about as I talk to my friends and colleagues in school districts is, schools are are a physical place that binds us together because we come under one roof every day of the week. And so the question, the big thought experiment of our time is like, once you take away the physical place we come to, what is school? And I really think that what school is the relationships between the adults and the kids and each other. That is the stuff that's left when the building is gone. And I was speaking with one colleague in the district who said, in terms of this e-learning, there are some teachers whose kids are coming every day. They're super excited to be in the Zoom call. Other teachers who are really having a tough time with attendance. It's kind of highlighting the care gap between some of these teachers, like where that care and strong relationship existed, kids, they still feel school. They still feel those relationships. Where it was more tenuous, they're not feeling school. So I feel like the key thing for e-learning, both around SEL, academic instruction, and keeping things moving forward, is really our relationships with one another. How can we communicate to our kids that we care about them? How can we help them stay connected with each other so they can benefit from that care? One small thing is, one principal told me that her teachers were sending letters to all their kids, like hand letters through snail mail. And it just made this tremendous impact because it signaled to the kids, I care about you. I'm thinking about you. I'm taking the time to do this. In the old days, that might not have been such a big deal, but in our electronic era, that is just a gigantic, tiny gesture that makes a huge outsized difference.
It's a social conversation by mail.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, so, Clark, what resonates with me is this notion of care, and how we demonstrate that we care. I have two sons, and their teachers just started doing kind of e-learning check-ins maybe 2 weeks ago or so. And just the notion of that connection made a big impact on my sons, that there was a community that they were a part of. It blew up, and now there's some notion of that community, and that was really kind of very putting my sons on the ground, very grounding for them. Oh, Bridget, I thought you had one more thing to say.
I mean, I always do, but I'm holding back.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for taking time to discuss this notion of systemic SEL. Bridget, we really appreciated your notion of teacher-student interactions and student-student interactions and how that creates the context for social and emotional development. Mark, your presentation on teacher development of social emotional skills and resilience hit home, I know, to a lot of different people. And Clark, your focus on measurement, and not only for student competencies, but also for things like school climate and culture and implementation, I think was a major contribution to the way that we think about systemic SEL.
Thanks, David. Thank you so much for facilitating this conversation. We really appreciate it.
And thank you all, to you all out here.
Thank you to all of our panelists. Before we wrap up, I just want to mention, I know we didn't get to all of the questions, and I'm sorry we weren't able to answer everybody's questions today. We will send out information. You'll probably receive an email tomorrow. It will include a link to the archive of this presentation, a copy of the presentation PowerPoint file. It will include instructions about how to request a certificate if you would like a certificate for participation in this. That will go out to everybody who participated today via Zoom or on our live stream over Facebook, or folks who registered. And we just want to say thank you so much. And if you have any further questions, you can reply to that email when you get it. And we are happy to answer any additional questions. We'll also put all the panelists' contact information in that follow-up email. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good day, everyone.